Thank you for being here, Ambassador Vetter. My question regards the U.S.-China trade situation. The disagreement with China and the U.S. regarding protection of United States intellectual property has led to massive tariff retaliations on U.S. agriculture exports. So my question is, how should the U.S. deal with that? And specifically, would a switch from retaliatory tariff system to a multilateral pressuring be possible and effective? Or does the fact that U.S. trade allies have neglected to join the U.S.-China trade negotiation in the past decade indicate that they would be unwilling to participate in such multilateralism?
Great. Well, that is a very good question. I think we've heard folks touch on it a little bit before. But let me start for a minute just by saying how pleased I am to have the opportunity to talk to Yider Institute students and to be back in my home state. This is why I was involved in the Yider Institute to begin with. So pleasure to be with you. I think you ask a great question, which is, are the current tactics we're using effective? If they're not, how can we change course and what role do our allies play? And I think a lot of the previous panelists have expressed some regret that we didn't really recruit our allies to send the same message to China. And in my experience, many of our allies have exactly the same frustrations we have about, theft of intellectual property, forced technology transfer, not following science-based rules when it comes to agriculture. We have a lot of similar grievances, but I'm not sure we really tried to get them on our side. And I think we have given China the ability to play us off of some of our competitors. If you look at, Brazil is enjoying a new market for their soybeans that they may not have otherwise had. And so when you have an economy the size of China, where no country really, I think, can decouple from 1.5 billion consumers, by creating a bilateral conversation, I think we have in fact increased the ties between China and our allies, where we could have fought more on a unified front. I would also say that maybe one aspect that I think about a lot and we haven't talked about in this trade conversation is how much our agricultural future and China's agricultural futures are tied. And that's true in many other sectors of the economy. But we actually need China to modernize their agriculture. We need China to do well. And if you talk to U.S. pork producers, they will tell you, and of course African swine fever now devastating the Chinese hog market, when China produces more pork, the U.S. sells more pork to China because it is widely available at a lower price. It becomes more of a staple in Chinese households. And so oddly enough, sometimes when agricultural flourishes in other countries, it creates the kind of consumers and prosperity and appetite for our products as well. Further, if China doesn't modernize its agriculture in a way that uses its natural resources correctly, what does that mean for carbon emissions? What does that mean for global use of water as a scarce resource? And if we don't really approach our ag conversation with China, not just about trade, but on how our services and our technology and our cooperative approaches could be helping the sectors, again, that win-win on both sides, and trade being part of that, to say we can be part of your solution, but we need certainty. So I've been thinking a lot more about whether having a trade conversation and an ag productivity conversation and a security conversation separately really gets us to the set of trade-offs we might need to try and change their behavior.
Thank you. Thank you again for being here. My question kind of builds on Sarah's question too. It's a two-part question. So first, considering U.S. global trade relations are critical right now, what bilateral and multilateral agreements should we be focused on pursuing right now? And second, as a former U.S. trade negotiator in agriculture, what challenges did you face with imposing heightened standards on animal health and safety, such as accusations of violation of the sanitary and phytosanitary measures agreement and other just generally non-tariff barriers?
Sure. So two big questions there. I think the fact that we have spent the past few years essentially renegotiating some relationships that were working well instead of establishing new relationships is a real lost opportunity. And I think it's good that we were able to reclaim some of that market access that we had established with Japan. I think that's hugely important for the competitive position, particularly for our meat producers into that market. But if you look at, I mean, we had free trade with Mexico and Canada in all but a very small set of products. And we had a good blueprint for a strong trade relationship with Japan. But if you look at the populations that are growing fastest, both in terms of numbers and in terms of purchasing power and joining the middle class, we don't have a plan for solidifying those relationships with countries in Southeast Asia, for example. We don't have, and it's a vexing problem, I'm not sure I have the answer, for how to sort of deepen or create a more certain relationship with India. But if you look at, I think we've largely ignored the continent of Africa in how we help to build up their trade regimes and really establish those deeper relationships. But that's where the economic dynamism is going to be, and that's where our consumers are going to be from an ag perspective. So I would really like to see us have an offensive trade agenda in establishing those relationships. On the SPS side, it is so helpful, and Warren had referred to this earlier, that we have an SPS agreement that says you should be making your rules on food safety and plant health and animal health based on science. You should do so transparently. You should give people a chance to have adjustment time to be able to comply and not sort of have those kinds of rules, which are important, right? Because our ag future is dependent on having healthy livestock and healthy plants and not letting disease ravage our productivity. But it should be based off of a set of rules, and you should have the same like products in like circumstances, we say, so that you're treating products fairly based on their scientific circumstances. And it's frankly really hard to tell the difference. And so when you are negotiating in trade, it's hard to tell sometimes whether a country genuinely has a scientific concern and when they are kind of pushing those questions to the extreme to simply delay doing the right thing. And sometimes that comes down to capacity. And we are the United States, and so without international standards, without other guidelines or parameters, we could just make our own, right? We have an entire cadre of scientists. We have land-grant universities who can help us do the research and figure out how to attack these issues. There are a lot of countries that don't. Maybe they have 5 people in their whole customs service with a PhD who know what to do to control a plant disease. And so the easiest thing, if you think that really your ag future's under threat, is just close the darn border till you can figure it out. And so sometimes it's a matter of building capacity, understanding their situation, rebuilding trust and confidence, and then reopening the market. And depending on where they start, that can take a while. Sometimes it is a matter of continually moving the goalposts and using, in fact, the scientific knowledge that they have to come up with question after question after question, even when we have basically answered the questions about risk. And so, figuring out at what point you're not having a scientific conversation, you're not, and you're really having a political one, can be hard. And frankly, the WTO, where you go to a dispute settlement body full of trade officials who are not themselves scientists, are a little bit squeamish about saying this dispute is purely political versus scientific because they don't necessarily have that expertise. So we haven't, adjudicating those problems is not perfect either. I personally believe the US needs to invest a lot more time and energy into our international standard setting bodies, the International Plant Protection Convention, the Codex Alimentarius on food safety, to start sort of building up that scientific capacity, to start building standards that have general confidence among food safety and animal and plant health regulators so that it's easier to get them to enforce them. And so frankly, that we all know each other. So when we have a conflict, we can work together to solve it.
Ambassador Vetter, I want to stick to kind of a common theme, which is the China trade war, and specifically in the context of supply chains and market share. So my question for you is, can we come back from kind of the hit that U.S. businesses have taken in terms of market share in the Chinese market? And can we jump back into supply chains? So if a company has already moved some of its production to Vietnam or somewhere else in Southeast Asia, is it possible that companies will move right back into China? Or what's the process going to look like maybe when things get solved? How long lasting is the hurt that the economy is feeling in terms of uncertainty and market share right now?
Whew, that's a big question. Well, let's start first with products that may be hurting from these tariffs or maybe facing tariffs in China, and how will they bounce back? I think that partly depends on how good our competitors are at taking advantage of their new better positioning, right? Is how much do they really establish that market share? But it partly depends on the kind of product, right? So soybeans, commodity, sold in bulk, you want them on spec and delivered on time. But in many ways, a soybean is a soybean is a soybean, right? I think that's a little bit different when you're talking about things like wine or even dried fruits and nuts, which have, you've got more of a brand attached to that agricultural product. And earning shelf space in a grocery store is not something you automatically get back. And so if you are squeezed out, even if the tariff goes tomorrow, it could be a number of years before you regain that sort of access to the consumer in the same way. So I think the relative time to rebound. But I think the actions that we have taken and the nationalistic language that we have used back and forth about punishing China, that kind of thing, there's a trust factor. And there's a nationalism factor in China that you want to buy Chinese first. And so I think, who knows how long that will linger and how much that has really been ingrained into buying behavior. And I think that'll be one of the open questions if and when we can get these tariffs to go away. The supply chain question, I now am in the private sector and working with a number of companies who are trying to read these tea leaves and to think about their supply chains, both for agricultural and non-agricultural goods. A lot of them just don't know what to do. And so I think what you're seeing is just a lot of delayed decision making. Like, is this trade war going to go on? Is it not? It would take massive investment and change to move my supply chain out of China. If I start doing it, will this trade war be over and then I go back? And frankly, there's not a good candidate for them to move their supply chains. So this is all part of the public record, but got the opportunity to work with and get to know a company that makes gas grills, probably something many of you have in your backyard. Those companies basically have all moved their production to China, except for sort of some very high-end gas grills. Most of them are now made in China. And China sort of makes them all according to the different specs and the individual characteristics, but really all in one industrial park in the same part of China. And this is not high tech. This is not China's 2025 policy where we're worried they're going to outcompete us in gas grill technology, right? But it is sophisticated enough. And if you think about the consumer product safety laws, this is fire that's kind of next to your house, right? So there are a lot of rules and regulations that have to be followed and precision that's required. And so you have a whole set of manufacturers who make all those parts, who are co-located, who know the specs and have long-term relationships with the US-based companies whose R&D and everything still is based here. Their production is in China, and who sell in the US at a price point that if they had to raise that by moving their supply chains, are not quite sure what would happen. But they don't think that first of all, it took them years to establish that. They're looking at least 3 years to be able to establish that somewhere else. Probably more to get all of the parts. And almost no chance, they think, that you could co-locate them in a way where you would have those efficiencies in relationships. And that's just one industry, but it's a story you hear over and over and over. So, what has been established in China in terms of efficiencies in manufacturing, it's not clear you could do that in a Vietnam or a Thailand and have the same skills, ability to co-locate, access to other markets, and establish shipping and logistics and all of that. That takes a lot of time, and there's significant, obviously, cost involved. And so, if you're not sure the trade war is going to last, if you don't know your product's going to be covered, when do you pull the trigger and say, okay, now I got to move? And once you move, can you afford to do it again? So I'm not sure I have the answer, but just trying to illustrate for you, I think that kind of limbo process where a lot of U.S. companies find themselves.
I had another question on a much smaller scale. If the WTO dispute settlement mechanism is rendered ineffective at the end of this year, how will that affect individual farmers in a state like Nebraska, and how can their attorneys help prepare them for that?
Oh, their attorneys. I don't know. That question is harder. For all of the complaints about the WTO appellate body or the WTO dispute settlement body, and for the length of time it takes for a case to wind its way through it, it has served the U.S. pretty well. 80+% of the cases that we've taken, we have won. In many cases, before it has to wind its way all the way through that process and get to a compliance panel and tariffs, changes to policy, can be made before you get to that retaliation phase. And if nothing else, it raises a spotlight on the kind of behavior, and it helps bring, again, a lot of those countries together to say, hey, I've got that problem too. Let's put some joint pressure on countries to reform. But if there is no sort of stick at the end, if they can't get through that process, then I think it does sort of invite, it creates a situation where folks know they may not be held accountable. And so I think the lack of the appellate body does a couple of things. One is it just adds to the general situation of uncertainty, that we can call out bad behavior, but we don't have an opportunity to sort of bring that to its conclusion. The second, and there are far more trade attorneys in this room, of which I am not one, who I would say, as a law student, you should engage while they're here. There's a few of them over there. But the agricultural agreement, Warren had said, that's new. Right? Agriculture came into the global trading system much later than a number of other sectors. And so we need a legal system to test what those agreements meant, right? To create new jurisprudence and precedents and an interpretation of what those negotiations mean and how countries have to follow them. And I think that's maybe more important for the ag agreement, or the ag agreement just being younger and having fewer of those cases. It's disappointing to see that system may not be fully operational to help really elaborate what those commitments are.
Well, I'll ask one more question to a question that came up in our class in International Business Transactions with Professor Schaefer. When determining what country to establish direct foreign investment in, how big of a consideration is the fact of whether we have a BIT with that country or not, and should it be more of a factor?
I think it is important that it certainly helps to elaborate again what the terms of that investment are, that you can have a greater guarantee that they're going to allow and protect that investment and the free flow of capital and resources back and forth. I'm looking at the current trade discussion and thinking, if what I want is to establish a facility in a place that gives me the most options, Mexico looks pretty good. They've got a trade agreement with many more countries than we have. You can ship tariff-free there. I think that sort of trade ties, the stability of that messaging on trade, those relationships, they do have an influence on where you want to be and what options you have. And so, again, I think thinking about attracting FDI here and about wanting to keep facilities here, having options for people who manufacture here to serve both the US market and other customers because of those trade relationships is really important. But then also thinking about flows of foreign direct investment to other places, be interesting to really map out then what options establishing your manufacturing facilities in those places give you in terms of the other trade agreements that they have.
Thank you.
So I want to ask kind of like a broad question outside of maybe trade policy that has more to do with how the public views trade. So in 2016, the two major contenders to both rejected TPP. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump said that they were not big fans. And now Donald Trump, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, they all have relatively hawkish positions on trade. And so I'm wondering, how do you see, what do you see as the best way to sell the American people on trade, especially our generation, who are maybe kind of first coming into the public forum, and we are the greatest, we've benefited a lot in the past from this trade. How do you sell the idea of trade, the idea of multilateralism, to the American public and to the globe as a whole?
That's a question I've thought a lot about. Watching really in the course of an 18-month campaign, trade sort of become the boogeyman for a lot of the angst that people were feeling about the economy and for globalization generally. And there's a part of me that's saying, shame on us for not very clearly, those of us who do trade every day, not clearly connecting the dots between having a strong trading system and the benefits that we all see. And I think, Andrea, who you'll hear from later, who is in the audience here, talks about us being sort of trade blind and that the benefits are often diffuse and around us all every day, strawberries in January and a $5 t-shirt and, the great amount of choice and at relatively, affordable prices for goods from around the globe. We take it for granted and we don't think about the underpinnings and the systems and the relationships that make that possible. And so I think we haven't connected the dots, and we've spoken in this language of tariffs and rules of origin and this sort of arcane language of trade without making it real for people, and we have to do better. And I think we have all sorts of interesting tools to do that better in social media and other ways to connect that we didn't have. But I also think we forget sometimes that the benefits of trade do not accrue equally to countries and to populations within the country. And creating great international rules for how products flow also requires then countries to make good domestic rules so that those trade flows are shared better and more broadly. And it doesn't, you can't have one without the other. And, if you look at, the farm economy here, where you have a proliferation of smaller farms doing more specialty work, you have a proliferation of, a growth of really large farms, and those folks in the middle are really getting squeezed. What are we doing to help them manage risk, to diversify the markets, local, national, and international, that they serve, to help them weather storms and changes in trade, in other markets? What are we doing to make sure that participation has broad benefits, but also protections for the fact that we live in a competitive and a fast-paced society where those policies can change. It's not just weather that we have to think about, and I don't think we've done that very well. I was really hopeful, actually, during the Trump campaign, where this appeal to lost manufacturing jobs and preparing people to be successful, that maybe actually this renewed focus on trade would finally get the United States to focus in a serious investment in apprenticeship and job training and, really making those people who have worked in industries that are not as competitive on the global stage, preparing them to be competitive contributors in a global economy. But we have done nothing on that front. We've complained a lot about our competitors. I don't think we've invested at all in the resources and the human capital that we have, and I think that's unfortunate.
Thank you to the students, to Ambassador Vetter. We're out of time for this panel, but those were great questions, and we appreciate Ambassador Vetter's participation here, as well as Justin, Nichole, and Sarah. So please join me in thanking them.
Thank you.